A very good morning, students. Today we will study literary terms and concepts. These literary terms and concepts are only for the final year students. So, let's begin with the first literary term, paradox. What is a paradox and how it is used in literature? So, a paradox is a statement which seems on its face to be logically contradictory or absurd, yet turn out to be interpretable in a way that makes good sense. For an example, we can say John Donne's sonnet, Death Not to Be Proud, and the final lines of the sonnet are one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more, death thou shalt die. So the paradox is used occasionally by almost all poets, but was a persistent and central device in the 17th century metaphysical poetry, both in its religious or secular form. So John Donne, who wrote a prose collection entitled Problems and Paradoxes, exploited the figure of the poetry. His poem, The Canonization, for example, is organized as an extended proof full of local paradoxes or the paradox or the paradoxical thesis that sexual lovers are saints. Paradox is also a frequent component in verbal wit. If the paradoxical utterance uh, conjoins two terms that are in ordinary usage are contradictory, it is called an oxymoron. An example is Alfred Tennyson's uh, O Death in Life. The days are no more. The oxymoron was a familiar type of Petrarchan conceits in Elizabethan love poetry in phrases like pleasing pain, I burn the freeze, loving head. It is also a frequent figure in devotional prose or religious poetry as a way of expressing the Christian mysteries which transcend human sense and logic. So John Milton describes the appearance of God in his famous book Paradise Lost, dark with excessive bright thy skirts appear. So paradox was a prominent concern of many new critics who extended the terms from its limited application to a type of figurative language so as to make it encompass all surprising deviation from or qualifications of common persistence or commonplace option. It is this extended sense of the term that Clint Brook is able to claim with some uh, plausibility that the language of poetry is poetry of paradox. So I think you have got the idea about paradox. So come to the next term, and our next term is antithesis. Antithesis is a contrast or opposition in the meaning of contagious phrases or clauses that manifest parallelism, that is, a similar word order and structure in their syntax. If we go for an example, Alexander Pope's description of Atticus in the epistles to Dr. Evnod, uh, what is he wrote? Willing to go bound and yet afraid to strike. So, in the antithesis, in the second line of Pope's description of the Baron's design against Belinda in uh, his famous book, The Rape of the Lock, the parallelism in the syntax is made especially prominent by alliteration in the antithesis noun. In, uh, in a way, the antithesis is similarly heightened by the alliteration in the contrast noun. For one more example, if I say marriage has many pain but celibacy has no pleasures, this is also an example of antithesis. So, a contrast or opposition in the meaning of a sentence that is called antithesis. Our next term is symbolism, and symbolism stands for the use of symbols. And what is a symbol? Symbol is when you want to say something else by the meaning of something else, that is called symbols. So various poets of romantic period, including novels, Haydn in Germany and Shelley in England, often use the private symbols in their poetry. Shelley, for example, repeatedly made symbol use of objects such as the morning and evening star, a boat moving upstream, winding caves, and the conflict between a serpent and an eagle. William Blake also used extended his old romantic contemporary in his resource to a persistent and sustained symbolism. That is a coherent system composed of a number of symbolic elements, both in lyric poems and his long prophetic or epic poem. In 19th century America, a symbolist procedure was prominent in the novels of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, the prose of Emerson and Thoreau, and the poetic theory and practice of Edgar Allan Poe. So, in the usage of literary historian, the symbolist movement designate especially a group of French writers beginning with the Charles Baudelaire and including such later poets as Arthur Rimbaud, Paul Verlaine, Stephen Mallarmé, and the Paul Valéry. So all these started this movement symbolism. But in the modern period, in the decade of after World War First, was this symbolism was a notable thing in literature. In the decade after World War First, many of the major writers of the period exploit symbols, which are the part down from the religious and esoteric traditions, and in the part invented. Some of the words of the age are symbolist in their setting, their agents and their actions, as well as the objects they refer to. Instances of a precisely symbolist procedure occur in many poems, such as W. B. Yeats' Byzantium poem, Dylan Thomas' series of sonnets, and in longer poem of T.S. Eliot's, as we may give example of The Wasteland and many others. So all these poems, all these poets stands for symbols. So I think the idea of symbolism is clear to you. Now come to the next symbol, next term, satire. Satire is Satire can be described as a literary art of diminishing or derogating a subject by making it ridiculous and evoking toward its attitude of amusement, contempt, scorn, or indignation. It differs from the comic in that comedy evokes laughter mainly in an end in itself, while satire derides that it uses laughter as a weapon and against a but that exists outside the work itself. That but may be an individual in we can say in personal satire or a type of person, a class, an institution, a notion, or even as and even in the entire for the entire human race. So the distinction between the comic and the satiric, however, is sharp only in its extremes. Many plays of Shakespeare and Shakespeare's characters also represent this satire. Shakespeare's Falstaff is a comic creation presented primarily for our enjoyment, and the second character, Molyneux, in Shakespeare Twelfth Night is for the most part comic, but has aspect of satire derived against the type of uh, fetus and hypocritical Puritan, and in Ben Jonson's Wolfone, that is clearly satirized the type of person whose cleverness or stupidity is put in the service of cupidity, and John Dryden's MacLauchlan, while representing a permanent type of presentation, poet-star satirizing especially the living author Thomas Sandwell. So satire has usually been justified by those who practice it as a corrective of human voice and foolish. Alexander Pope, for example, remarked that those who are ashamed of nothing else are so of being ridiculous. So, to ridicule others, a poet may use the weapon which is called satire. I think the idea is clear. Next come and the next term is essay. What is essay? Essay any short composition in prose that undertake to discuss a matter, express a point of view, persuade, persuade us to accept a thesis on any subject or similarly certain. The essay differs from the treatise or dissertation in its lack of presentation to be a systematic and complete exposition and in being addressed to a general rather than a specific audience. As a consequence, the essay discusses its subject in non-thickly fashions and often with a liberal use of such devices as anecdote, striking illusions, and humors to augment its appeal. So, a useful distinction is that the formal, there are two distinctions, two types of essay, a formal and informal. The formal essay, or we can say it's an article, is relatively impersonal and author writes as its authority or at least a highly acknowledgeable and expounds the subject an orderly way. There are a lot of examples of such kind of essays and especially now come to the second type. Second type of essays are essays which are personal essays. A writer gives his own thoughts, that is are personal essays. So I think it is also clear to you. Now come to the next one, and the next term is allegory. Allegory is a narrative, whether in prose or it may be in verse, in which agents and actions and sometimes the setting as well are contrived by the author to make coherent sense of the literal or primary level of signification and at the same time of a signified a second correlated order of significance. We can distinguish two main types of allegory: historical allegory and political allegory, in which the characters and actions that are signified literally in that term represent or allegorize historical personages and events. So, if we go for an example in John Drayton's Absalom and Achitophel, King David represents Charles II and Absalom represents his natural son Duke of Monmouth, and the biblical story of Absalom's rebellion against his father. So, this kind of they allegorize the rebellion of Monmouth against King Charles. So the allegory of ideas in which the literal character represent concept and plot allegorize an abstract doctrine or thesis. So both type of allegory may either be sustained thought of a work as in Absalom and Achitophel and John Bunyan's Pilgrim Process, or else serve merely as an episode in non-allegorical work. A famous example of epistolal allegory is encounter of Satan with his daughter Sin, as well as with Death, who is represented allegorical as the son born of their incestuous relationship in John Milton's Paradise Lost. So, this these types of allegory. The second type, the sustained allegory of ideas. The central device is the personification of abstract entities such as virtues, vices, state of mind, modes of life, and type of character. And in such references are numerous in literature. So I think you have got the idea of what is an allegory. So this is all for today's lecture. Thank you.